Welcome back. So today we are going to talk about KZ's ESX. The ESX, of course, is their 10th anniversary set. It is a bit special for KZ to be celebrating 10 years in the business. And they did put out a very nice looking set that sort of looks like this. The back faceplate had what they described as a crack pattern. So it is actually kind of a 3D crack pattern. It's actually quite nice. The bottom is a clear shell, and you can actually see the 12 millimeter dynamic driver in there. So quite nice. This, of course, is not the standard stock cable. This is one of my custom cables. It's a pure silver copper mix. So I don't know. I just kind of grabbed that one and went with it. The stock cable actually is this one. It is one that you've seen before. It's been on many of the recent KZ sets. Also in the box is a letter of thanks, which you can see there, and a 10th anniversary coin, which you can see there. And it is literally a coin you can kind of pop out of the box, and it's got the KZ logo on it, Knowledge Zenith, and 10th anniversary on there. So quite nice, a little bit special for the 10th anniversary. So before we get into it, maybe we'll rant for a second about KZ's release schedule. So for those of you who've been following for the past few months, you know, the KZ has released quite a few really good sets, lots of single dynamic driver sets. And as a consumer, I think that's actually kind of fun and fascinating to sit and watch the releases. Every 2 weeks, you're getting a new set, and that's pretty cool to follow. It's kind of nice to talk about. It gives a constant stream of things to look forward to and talk about when they're released. As a reviewer, though, you know, it's actually kind of a tiresome schedule of you get the ESX a week or two ago, you spend time for a week with it, and the next thing you know, you wake up in the morning and you see this, right? So this morning, I had been preparing all the notes last night, again, kind of the final version of it, and then all of a sudden, oh, the next great thing is actually coming out in another week or two, the CCA Lyra. So we don't know anything about it, but, you know, this has happened a few times before, and it's sort of getting a little tiring to sort of get ready to hype the latest set, the best set ever kind of thing, and then they release, you know, the next best thing. So I always feel like I'm sort of slightly behind because I'm just getting to the point of talking about ESX, and yet the new one is already out, and people are probably already looking forward to it, and I'm already looking forward to it. So to go back and talk about ESX, it sort of feels like kind of deflated talking about, you know, the previous set when the next set's another 2 weeks. So if I sound a little deflated, a little kind of beat up on it, I'm just kind of a little tired of the schedule of preparing reviews and notes and then having KZ release a set just, you know, right before I get a chance to review it. It's a kind of been a hard schedule for the past couple months, and it sort of leads right into where I started. Even before I knew that Lyra was coming out, that was going to be my first bullet point. KZ has really released too many good releases recently. If you talk about the EDA Trio, the CRA Plus, the EDX Ultra, all these sets are pretty much in the same performance, you know, ballpark, price ballpark. It's getting a bit confusing trying to recommend which set to which person and what's the best set out of the recent ones and why is this one different than this one. But, you know, generally, if this is your first attempt at buying an IEM and this is going to be your first KZ set, it almost doesn't really matter which one you buy. They're all generally good, especially all these recent ones from EDA, EDX Ultra, and CRA Plus, and now ESX. Really great starter sets, and I don't really have there's no big complaints with ESX at all. It's just that it's confusing. Do you buy CRA Plus or do you buy ESX? Because they are all very similar. And if we take a look quickly at a graph, you can sort of, if you're motivated and a little more experienced, you can kind of look at the graphs and say, well, there's sort of a hair's difference between at least these three. The big difference sort of happens in this lower treble area, and some of this is a little different too. But yeah, it's sort of, you know, I can talk about the difference between the sets, but as a person who may be purchasing their first one, you're almost better off just finding your budget level and which faceplate you like and kind of going with it. And from there, you'll sort of understand what your likes and dislikes. But yeah, but really it's just getting a little bit confusing with so many releases that are so close in performance and price that it's getting a bit confusing. So take that into consideration. So what is ESX generally? I think my first description was it's a chill. It still has dynamics. They didn't, KZ ZES, and yet another recent set that was kind of okay, but that one didn't really have the dynamics. It had the 12 millimeter driver, but not so much the dynamics. It kind of felt a little slow and a little sluggish, not so great. This one is a little more chill, but it has the dynamics. It actually sounds pretty good. Dynamics-wise, it's bassy, and it's kind of a very reasonable V signature. This isn't 10 years ago KZ, or 5 years ago, or even 4 years ago. Not a big, huge V shape, that big metallic treble. That's not what ESX is at all. This is kind of a chill, relaxed, still a bassy set, but a very reasonable V-shaped signature. Second description, something like KZ fixes the CRA plus the upper treble bit. And for those of you who watched my CRA review, so this one has pretty much the same bass as CRA plus. So there's a lot of CRA plus here, CRA plus, kind of tracks. And then ESX takes a dip through the treble. So they actually brought down the levels. So this peak in particular, that's probably like 12 or 13K on CRA plus, was a bit buzzy in your ear. This upper treble had a little ringing to it. Maybe the 5K had a little bit of extra that you weren't really into. So I think ESX really fixed those bits, some of those bits that people complained about, and I complained a little bit about them as well. But so KZ fixed the CRA plus. It fixed the ZES mud. If you're into the 12 millimeter driver, the ZES was that driver, but it was quite muddy and not all that clear. And I think ESX also actually fixes a lot of the timbre problems from many prior sets, especially with a lot of the, and I don't have the higher peaks, but KZ's house sound used to be super peaky, and those peaks sort of led to timbre problems and instruments sounding off and vocals sounding off, and ESX is really kind of reined all that stuff in. It's a much more natural, easygoing, kind of relaxed version of a more natural set. So I do think it actually fixed many of the problems of prior sets in that area. So what works on ESX? Like I said, it actually has this safe signature. It's got smaller peaks, and it's definitely going to work well for people who like the bass a bit more forward. The mid's kind of a hair below, which isn't all that uncommon for a V-shaped signature. And this one does have a more polite treble compared to KZ sets of even a year ago when they had some really big peaks in the treble. This one is much more kind of down slope and runs a bit low. You can kind of see this blue line as ESX, and it sort of from 8K onward, it actually tracks below most KZ sets. So this is definitely a more relaxed treble than what they've done in the past. So a little something different for the 10th anniversary, I guess, something they've been kind of working on. So I do think that part works. And like I said, that signature itself is actually quite a modern signature. It's not all that far from, say, Oxygen or BL03. It's just kind of level differences between these modern signatures. And I do think they pick some subtle level decisions that actually work really well here. So the bass level is probably a little bit more elevated than I would like, but coming into the mids, not bad at all. And then they popped up about 2.2, and that's not too bad. And then they do downslope down through about 5 and then back up to 8. But this downslope from about 2 to 5 is actually, a sort of modern take. Lots of sets have been doing that one lately. And what really happens is there's lots of sharp instruments, and you get some cymbals, some electric guitars, maybe get some synths from electronic music. And if you bump up 5K too much, those sound a little bit too sharp. And I think KZ sort of really nailed this downslope, and it very much does work really well for those types of musics that you, even on CRA Plus, that may have kind of pinged your ears. You don't get that on ESX. It's a much more relaxed version of that. So yes, so modern, subtle level decisions. I think they did pretty good about sort of matching some other currently popular sets. I think they picked some really good levels there. So not the biggest stage, but it is quite spacious and lots of separation and a real strong centrality. And I felt like making up a word last night, so we'll call it centrality. But yeah, the staging on ESX isn't super huge, and lately KZ has sort of been really nailing stages, and they're not necessarily always the biggest, but always lots of separation. And this is another one where I wouldn't say it's the biggest, most immersive stage ever, but it actually works really well on this set because everything is separated. Lots of space in between instruments, and for a $15 set, it's actually really, really good. But yeah, I think KZ is, especially on these recent sets, KZ has been really nailing a much better sense of stage than they have in the past, and much better than most budget sets and probably most sets that are even above the $15 price point there. So do think that works. So what kind of doesn't work? So the V-shape, especially on this 12 millimeter driver, the V-shape with a little elevated bass, it definitely does hide most of the technicalities. So it does feel a little bit behind EDA and some of the other 10 millimeter faster drivers like CRA. And, I don't necessarily agree that the technicals are all that far behind, but what do they sound like with that bass level where it's sort of hiding them? I do think it does sound a little bit behind EDA. But I think in reality, if you EQ it and turn the bass down a little bit so you can actually hear some of the detail and the resolution and the speed, it's actually not as far behind as what I would say just from reading that line. So if that does bother you, definitely play with EQ, definitely turn the bass down so you can actually hear the mids in sort of a clearer, sharper version than what they are out of the box, getting hidden by a little bit of this bass. And sort of to follow on with that, I think the bass does sort of ripple negatives through the signature. It's just a little too elevated. It pops above the mids a little bit too much, and especially when drums or there's a big bass sound, I think your mids do sort of fall right under that. And, I think that's a, very traditional KZ thing to do. But if you do turn it down a little bit, it actually is quite good. But I think at this level, and I much would have preferred they've gone with the EDA level. I much prefer the lower version of these modern KZ sound. Just a few, 2 to 3 decibels, 2 decibels, even down below into this mid bass, I think it actually clears things up quite a bit. It's a cleaner sound, more texture on the bass, more detail, and I think that would have been a better decision for me, but they went with the higher level, which is a more fun level. So I do think it causes some other problems that hide some of the nicer things about this 12 millimeter throughout the signature, just hiding underneath the bass. So turn it down a little bit if that's what you're into. So the treble, and almost for the same reason, that the bass is kind of strong and the treble is a little bit on the lighter level side. So the whole thing slants just slightly dark. And, if it was me, I would have balanced the levels out a little bit more, but I do think this one comes off as a light treble. It's slightly, and dark is kind of a heavy term for it. It's not really dark. It's just a little bit lighter and level than probably what I would have picked compared to the bass level that they're using. But that does reduce the notable extra sibilance, which we've seen on some of the previous sets. Even CRA Plus had a little extra sibilance, and when you knock these treble levels down a little bit, that tends to be much less noticeable, and I think on ESX that is pretty much very true. So let's get into some more detail. So on the bass level, like I said, I do prefer the EDA level. I do prefer a little lighter bass on a set like this, on this signature, but it's not horrible. It's not out of control. It's just a little bit too elevated, and it affects the mids a little bit. And at higher volume, I think it definitely does swallow the track a little bit. A little too much bass tends to take over the whole track. So I noticed it. People who prefer a heavier bass set probably not going to notice it, not going to complain at all, but that was just my feeling on it. And for me, this really comes down to the difference between a $50 set and a $15 set. A lot of it comes down to bass control and how your dynamic driver really handles that transition from heavy bass into your mids and keeping the two clean and having very clear, articulate mids, and the more you let these sort of bleed into each other, the closer it sounds to $15. The cleaner they get, the more it sounds to $50. So when you EQ it, it actually does sound closer to $50. It can actually be quite clean. But out of the box, I think the bass level is right on for the price. And the bass, like I said, it does sort of mask the mids, and the stage comes a little more compressed because of this persistent sort of bass that's a little stronger than it should be, and the treble as well. So, but I think speed-wise and detail-wise, it's definitely closer to CRA Plus than ZES. ZES was kind of off. I think that was definitely one of their first tries at the 12 millimeter, and not as successful as it should have been. So the mids, like I said, a bit under the bass. It's sort of a V shape, and the mids kind of are recessed to hair. So it sounds okay in resolution. And I think that's just mainly because the bass is a little stronger than it should be. The mids are a little bit back. And when you combine the two, it sort of feels like the resolution is just okay. But reduce the bass a little bit, and the resolution will actually sound a little better. That's what I did. The mids, and for that simple reason, I think EDA did the mids a little bit better than ESX does, simply because the levels are a little better. So, and like I said, it puts it behind the EDA. And especially for me, I think people tend to notice the bass and sort of enjoy it and kind of nod your head to it. But people tend to fixate on the mids. And when the mids are slightly off, people really complain about it. So KZ is always sort of focused on this fun bass, which is fine. But when it comes down to sorting sets by sound quality, people really get fixated on the mids and how the resolution sounds and the detail and the speed and all these things that can tend to be buried a little bit or masked by the bass. So I think going forward in the next 10 years, they really sort of have to find this balance between fun and technicals, and this is sort of where you start. So yeah, I think people do fixate on the mids, and they're sorting KZ sets all in the same price point essentially by their mids, and the bass tends to be not all that far from each other. So the upper mids, especially on ESX, they're a little cooler tone, and that gives you sort of this a cleaner imprint on the mids. It's actually kind of nice, especially if you decrease the bass. But they sort of tuned, and it's actually quite nice levels. The bass level is just a little bit too high, but this 2.2 kilohertz, the way that rises, not a ton of energy, but certainly enough energy to keep these a little clearer, a little more articulate, and I think that actually works out quite well. The only difference is, and I think I get to that next, is it should rise probably a little closer to 2.5 kilohertz, which would probably be perhaps maybe a less cooler version, a less sharper version of that, and push the vocals back maybe just a millimeter. They're actually pretty good, but I would have pushed them back just slightly bit. EQ will take you from that bigger V shape, and it's kind of a reasonable bigger V shape, but towards a more mid-centric, cleaner version of it. And that's why I would say that male vocals really got me on this set, like Chris Martin on Avicii's Heaven. And the female vocals, and I think that's sort of where I'm heading, is this level, I think male vocals actually work really well. I think they're very natural. Chris Martin, the set kind of nails that playback. Female vocals, you're either going to say they sound okay, or you're going to say they're going to be lacking just a slight bit of energy. And a lot of that is where you like this peak. Do you like it at 2? Do you like it at 2.5? Do you like it a little higher or lower? Some people get really tuned into the energy in female vocals, and I will say that ESX, the whole treble bit is just a little bit more relaxed, and people are going to key off of that and say, this is a relaxed version of female vocals, which I think it is. And maybe they prefer a prior set that had a little more energy right there in that area. For me, I'm kind of okay with it. I sort of, if you're a little shy, that's tend to be a little better than going overboard and too sharp, too high, too unnatural. So I am not going to complain about female vocals, but certain people will definitely have a preference for more energy, less energy, And I think you can take a look at that, where that one peaks, and figure that one out on your own. But for me, it's actually pretty nice. So Treble, this may be the first KZ that's sort of polite and friendly in that downsloping 2 to 5K area, like I said. There aren't that many KZ sets that really downslope like this. Maybe your version of CRA does, or your version of ESX is a little higher, but mine definitely downslopes, and this whole thing sounds just a lot more relaxed and a lot more chill than past KZ sets. So I do think that is a little bit different with ESX. It's actually a pretty chill set. But the problem is, without that strong counterbalance in the treble to that bass level, it just leans slightly dark. And if you're expecting soaring strings, you're expecting, cymbals to have a certain amount of energy. They don't quite probably get there, especially if you're very used to having sets that have a higher treble level. Again, I think a song like Tori Amos, Cornflake Girl, the balance of it is just leans just heavily towards the bass, the bottom end. Her piano just sort of dominates and swallows the track a little bit, and it should really be evenly distributed across the sound, and it's just a little heavy on the bottom. And like I said, EQing kind of fixes that, but as it is out of the box, it's just not a treble heavy set. And songs like that, where you have a range of instruments, it's definitely going to gravitate towards or have a sort of center of gravity that's at the lower end of it. So, and like I said, the stage works here absolutely. The bass speed and clarity between instruments. The stage is definitely big enough for lots of separation. There isn't really any treble flattening because the treble is at a reasonable level. Just lots of small positives that added up to a nice stage here. Even though it may not be the nicest, hugest, biggest stage you've ever heard, it's actually well executed in the space, and not a whole lot of overlap between instruments. And I don't know, for some reason, I really liked it, even though I knew it wasn't the biggest stage, most immersive thing I've ever heard. I just think it comes out pretty well on ESX, so very much appreciated it for that, and kept listening to it a lot for that simple reason. So again, that's my take on the KZ ESX. Lots of stuff to digest there, but looking forward to seeing what this guy has in store. If you look really closely, maybe that's the XUN driver in there. I think that's why people are getting excited for it. That is why I was getting excited for it, and that's why I was sort of torn between having enough energy and hype to talk about ESX, but this was sort of weighing on my mind. Is KZ really revisiting the XUN driver and putting it into a 1DD set, which they haven't actually done before? It's really only appeared in a TWS alone. So this is a bit special for me. So we'll have to see if this really pans out and what I think it is. But there you go. Stay tuned. I'll be back in another 2 weeks with yet another set, and I will complain about there's so many same 1DD sets in the same price range yet again. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.